Hi everyone, it's GM Jared here from Nothing Venture Nothing Game, and welcome. Today we are going to be chatting about the best skill or action you could take in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, stick around, especially if you play other great tabletop role-playing games, such as the Titan of them all, Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, because this really conversation is all about how to use the single greatest action that you could do on your turn as a player, and how you as a GM can reward this action and actually make it extra special. So stick around.
And what you see before you is a four-legged animal standing in a tree. Go ahead and make a knowledge check. A 1. Impressive. What you know about this creature is it's very similar to those house cats you had when you were a child. And you just want to run up and grab it and pet it and play with it. And it doesn't look hungry at all.
So, what is that action? And that action is recall knowledge for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, or a knowledge check if you're playing other tabletop role-playing games. Now, for those of you first, why would I say recall knowledge or a knowledge check is the single greatest action you could do on your turn as a player, especially if you're kind of stumped? Well, for those of you tuning in who've played or are playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition, recall knowledge is a knowledge check done secretly by the GM, and depending on how well your stats affect the role, the secret role that your GM has just made, you will gain certain information. You will glean information as it is. You might suddenly know that they are immune to acid, the enemy you're fighting, or they have the capability of flight. If you're playing a different tabletop game, maybe you're playing Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition, you can use this skill as a bonus action. I know one of my good friends and a partner on our channel, Fabio, in their campaign, as a bonus action, a player can make a knowledge check to glean more information about the enemy. And they actually started doing this once they were playing in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. They built their character, a ranger, all about knowing their enemy. And it brought upon them this like idea that the more the player knows, the better it is. And we actually sat down and had a conversation, and why recall knowledge is really important, depending, whatever system you're playing. And why I say it's the greatest action you can take as a player, and the greatest action the GM can have happen at that table, is it does two things. One, for a player, Pathfinder 2nd Edition, maybe you're powered attack, like you're a fighter and you did power attack, and you're like, what else am I going to do? Maybe move. But if you're kind of in the mix, you're probably done everything you can, and you feel power attack is the best thing. Maybe you're not using a shield, so you can't use the raised shield action. Or maybe you're a wizard and you cast one of your spells. Most spells for Pathfinder 2nd Edition are 2 actions. And you're like, what do I do? Do I cast shield? It's a 10-minute recharge, especially if I'm targeted. Maybe I can make a check. Now, as per rules as written, and as per my rules arbiter Steve will tell you, if they fail the check, unless they have dubious knowledge, which is a feat, they shouldn't really glean any information. And I say, bah humbug to that statement. As a GM, it's my goal to build a world. Now, let's say we're playing in a standard campaign, right? Let's say we're playing in something pre-written. Maybe I'm playing, if you have 5th Edition, maybe I'm playing in Curse of Strahd, and maybe if I'm in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I'm playing the Adventure Path, the Agents of Edgewatch. And let's say we're fighting goblins, right? Very simple thing. I know in Curse of Strahd it's more gothic horror, but let's just say they're goblins. You rolled on a random chart, goblin showed up, whatever. And the players are like, well, I know goblins. I know goblins. I've been playing tabletop role-playing games since I was a wee young thing, and goblins are goblins, right? They're just a bag of hit points for me to destroy, to just take my rage out on. And let's say one of your players new to the table takes that action, says, you know what? I want to know about these goblins. Let me know more about these goblins. They roll. Or in your case, you roll, right? If the GM, if you're using the secret GM screen, you're rolling behind the scenes, making that secret check. Now, for me, I don't make secret checks. I let my players make their checks. Now, I understand, I've had this conversation. I could go into secret checks and why they're important, but you bought clickety clacks, use those clickety clacks. So you roll that check and you roll a 5. You're like, oh, clearly I don't know anything about these goblins. But wait, you're the GM. Maybe they don't glean anything of great importance. Maybe they don't glean like, oh, the goblin has a scroll of fireball or something like that. But what you do glean, you're like, whoa, it's okay. You roll the 5. No, don't worry about it, man. Look, this is what you know about these goblins. You take a second, you assess, and you realize that goblin over there, it's got a limp. Just got a limp. And maybe that one specific goblin, they are 5 feet slower than every other goblin. But you rewarded this. And then all of a sudden the player's like, what? And you're like, yeah, got a limp. You realize, you glean, oh man, that goblin, you notice it's got a little limp. When it ran up to the cleric to stab the cleric, it had like a little limp. And you're like, huh, that's interesting. And then all of a sudden as a player, you're like, you know what? That wasn't so bad. Let me try that again. Next time, now we're fighting vampires. Let me see what I could get on vampires. And we all know the typical vampire sun, garlic, holy water, religious symbol of a deity, good aligned magic hurts them. This time you're like, you know what? I know all that. I'm going to metagame. I'm going to metagame. And metagaming, that could be a whole different conversation. But most of us know that, right? So you make that check. Oh, this time you rolled at 15. 15, nice, high 15. You add your bonuses. And you're like, oh, I definitely know more. And all of a sudden, the GM's like, this is what you glean. You realize these vampires are a special sect of vampires. These vampires, they actually not just are afraid of, let's say they're not just scared of garlic. They hate gold. I'm stealing that from a comic. If you know what it is, you're cool. We could talk about that. But they're scared of gold. They don't like gold. You realized in all the stuff, maybe you burgled their treasure and you realize it's all silver and copper pieces, no gold, and the chandeliers are silver and stuff like that. And you're like, that doesn't make sense. Vampires don't like silver, right? Like silver hurts them in some of the lore and stuff like that. Werewolves, you're like, that's weird. They have a ton of silver, but no gold. You know what? Let me take a gold piece out. You flick it at them. And then as a GM, you're like, oh, the vampire coils back away from the gold. You're like, oh, what does that mean? And maybe in your world, in your lore, you didn't want to just flat out give this to them, right? Maybe maybe you're kind of like homebrewing Curse of Strahd. Maybe in Agents of Edgewatch, you're now dealing with a vampire. You throw it in there. And you're like, you know what? I want to homebrew in my world. Vampires don't like gold. Maybe it has something to do with the curse. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that they feel it's more of a psychological effect that they're going to have to pay the ferrymen to cross the river Styx. And they don't want the gold. The gold piece to them represents them moving on, leaving, having that their evil spirit go to the afterlife. And they don't want that. So they're scared of gold. And all of a sudden the player's like, what? Gold? Okay, we could work with this. Oh, I'm gonna coat my sword, my dagger in gold. I'm gonna go out and seek. Now, mind you, gold is a very malleable metal. So in the real world, you won't want to like make a gold dagger because probably bend, especially if you're fighting vampires and stuff. The druid, right? So the concept of the druid not wearing metal armor is actually more of steel because it's not natural. Or iron. It was like one of those. Well, no, iron's natural. Steel isn't natural. Like you have to mix multiple metals to get like a hard metal, and that's why it wasn't natural and they couldn't use it. But druids were able to use natural metals, whatever you want to say, right? And you can let the druid have a gold dagger, right, or a gold sickle. or something. And or maybe everyone like puts on gold, like they just clip gold coins on their chest and they run around just clinking and clanking with gold. But the vampires now have disadvantage, or they take a -1 whenever they're attacking, or they're flat-footed whenever they see gold, right? Like if you're playing Pathfinder 2nd edition, you give them the flat-footed condition. If you're playing Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, you give them disadvantage on their attacks when gold is visible to them. You know, now maybe the vampires start casting darkness so that they can't see the gold. You know, it's like a psychological thing. If I can't see the thing I'm scared of, it's not really there. But this recall knowledge, this check that you can make both on the player side and on the GM side, suddenly becomes a tool for you, the GM, to build your world out. Suddenly, all of a sudden, the players are constantly taking that action, that bonus action, or that single action to make a recall knowledge check. You know, all of a sudden, they're not so confident, or maybe they want to know more, or maybe they're not so confident that the trolls are resistant to fire, right? Like, or have weakness to fire, right? Like we all know trolls regeneration stops at fire and acid, right? Like that's a common trope in all of tabletop role playing, fantasy tabletop role playing. You fight a troll and you're like, I'm going to cast fireball or produce flame or something, and I'm going to stop it. And that's metagaming. We could go into a different conversation on metagaming and why, you know, it's okay, it's not okay. But this whole concept of using this recall knowledge, you can build your world as you go. As a GM, you build your world. Monsters suddenly have these different features that players didn't really know about. And players, you start to learn more about this world. Now, recall knowledge does come with a caveat, because as all good GMs know, it's okay to fib a little bit, stretch the truth, tell a little white lie. And I've done this before. I've had my players roll recall knowledge, and, you know, they rolled low and I gave them a little piece of information. They rolled high, they got a lot of information. You know, not just, oh, their AC is 17, or, oh, their reflexes, or, you know, they have a high dex save, or, you know, stuff like that. You know, they cast spells, they're arcane caster, they're divine caster. You know, they'll figure that out as they go. But I was giving them other little tidbits about these characters, these monsters that they're dealing with. And as we went, I realized they started to believe everything as the gospel truth. And that's when I would secretly put things in that really wasn't truth, and they would trust it. So like one of them was like recently happened, they were fighting, like magical mayhem happened, as it always does, and they somehow pulled up this underground giant worm. They brought it to the surface by accident. It was real angry, but before it could attack anything, because of the magic chaos that was happening, it was floating in the air, and they were like kind of running past it, and it never attacked them. They couldn't figure it out. Finally, the magic broke and it fell on the ground. It actually dropped on two players and knocked them prone, so they were underneath it. And then they were like, so their turns go, right? This creature's on the floor, it's wiggling, doesn't have any eyes, you know, it's a worm-like creature. Best way to describe it, it looked like, if you've ever seen the movie Tremors, think that kind of monster. Was, oh, okay, so it can't see us, it never really attacked us, maybe it's not hostile. And one of the players rolls, and they rolled like a 5 or a 2. It was very low. And I was like, oh, you realize that sound kind of drives them away. They don't like sound. So the player instantly just goes, make a lot of noise. The things hate sound. It bothers them. And one of my players turns, runs, starts to make a performance, and as much sound, banging, stomping, blah, 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 blah. Okay, that was on their turn. End of their turn, you know, monster goes. The players are like, okay, it's clearly going to drive them off. The thing spends its action to move, dives into the ground, starts to burrow on the ground. They're like, oh, it ran away. Clearly it ran away. The sound worked. The player's like, awesome, we learned something cool. All of a sudden the thing bursts out of the ground and lunges for the player that made a ton of sound. And it grabs them and attacks them. And all of a sudden the player's like, what the heck? I thought we drove it away. And the player's like, I thought sound made it not like sound. And another player was like, oh, I figured this out. Sound, it's attracted to sound. And, you know, then they were like kind of fending it off. And then they all start, you know, they were like, okay, we're going to fend it off. And then maybe we'll stop making sounds and stuff like that. And then that's how we'll be able to deal with this creature. So that's the other side of this, right? Players beware, buyers beware. But also on the other side, that's for the GM to throw a little curveball every so often. Maybe the goblin doesn't have a limp, or maybe it's faking that it has a limp, so it seems weaker. So when the other goblins are running and this goblin falls to the ground, it's like, oh, my leg. And the party inevitably comes over and befriends said friendly goblin. And 3 or 4 sessions in, this goblin's helped them out. It's carrying their gold. It saved one of the players, ran over, gave him, a potion. And the goblin's like, listen, I'll hold your gold. You saved my life. You spared my life. I owe you a life debt. I'll never leave your side. 3 or 4 sessions later, the goblin runs with all their gold. And they're like, what? And maybe one of the players wakes up. It's at night. The player wakes up for their watch. Maybe go use the potty. And they see the goblin, like, with a big bag just hobbling away. And then the player's like, whoa, where are you going, lefty? And they're like, the goblin's like, and starts, move faster. And then the player's like, lefty's running. And everyone's like, what's happening? And then, boom, the goblin takes off. And it turns out this goblin is a professional sprinter. This is what they do. This is their tactic. They attack a group. They fake an injury. And they know humanoids very friendly. Most of the time, humanoids very friendly for the most part, especially the ones who look like adventurers. They're usually known to sometimes be good and helpful. So they fake an injury. They have a goblin make believe it's the weakest. And then that's how they grab the shinies and run. And that's something, and that's why recall knowledge allows so much more in your campaign. So the next time you're playing, give it a try. Alert your players. Say like, hey, listen, next time you're playing, alert your players. Be like, hey, listen, I want to institute something, especially if you're playing Pathfinder 5th edition. Hey, listen, I want to institute something as a bonus action. You could take a knowledge check. I'm not going to make it eat your action. I know in the book sometimes it's an action, and players, with action economy, they're like, do I want to take that? Should I cast a spell? Should I drink this potion? We'll spend those moments maybe taking that second to make a knowledge check. And for Pathfinder 2nd edition players and GMs out there, I see it all the time on the forums. Like, my players don't really use recall knowledge. My players don't really spend that last action. They don't know what to do with that last action. Obviously, once that one player makes that recall knowledge check, maybe you don't give it at that 5. Maybe if they roll a 5, you don't give it. Maybe you're like, okay, you got to roll a 10 or 15, and now, you get the daisy chain of players using that last action to get that recall knowledge check. And maybe that spurns them all on, and that allows them to use that last action. Because, I do see the forums and, reading and stuff, and people are like, oh, recall knowledge, it's it's also up to you, the GM, to make these things viable and valuable to the players. Action economy is the most valuable thing in any system to the players. So a player spending that action should be given, not every time, but it shouldn't make it seem valuable. You're a hero to stop said catastrophe from happening, or you're trying to achieve something. And in doing that, in trying to achieve something, everything you do in that little daisy chain of doing stuff should lead you ahead. Maybe if it's kind of like a Swiss Army knife, it's what you as the GM give to your players. And then even you as the players, it's you have to trust that there comes a point in time, obviously, depending on your group, you always kind of want to have like a nice balance of trust between the players and the GM. And once you get to that balance, you'll realize, as the player, yes, that action economy is very valuable, and you don't want to lose every little bit. But taking that moment to ask for recall knowledge, you're also asking for lore, and you're interacting with the GM's world, whether it be homebrew or even like a standard adventure path. Not everything has to be like, I feel most GMs, they take an adventure path if they're doing an adventure path, and then they usually add a little bit of homebrew, and you get like something wonderful. And in that homebrew, you're kind of asking your GM like, hey, tell me more about this world that we're playing in. But yeah, so that is my belief on recall knowledge and why, or even like knowledge checks, right? Like, so if you're playing in a different edition, it'd be a knowledge check. Playing Pathfinder 2nd edition, it's recall knowledge. And, yeah, that's really my belief on it. I think it's the most valuable skill because it gives me the time as a GM to a world build with my players. You know, goblins do this trick where they feign a busted leg and then they steal from the goody two shoes. You know, certain vampires might have like certain traditions because they're ancient. You know, these creatures are long lived and they start to build these lore, you know, from one master to a fledgling to another fledgling. And then it's kind of, you know, it's like playing telephone. And all of a sudden, now you have this lore that you're built up in this world, you know, and it gives it a chance for the GM to really like spread their lore building wings. And, you know, for the player, you gain a little bit more. You know, maybe it's useful, maybe it's not useful, maybe it's a lie, you know, but that also makes it fun. You know, all of a sudden my players were like, oh my God, the worm thing sound is attracts the worm thing. And they were like, yeah, we should have figured that out, you know, after the combat. They were like, yeah, we should have realized that was wrong when we knew it didn't have eyes. And it made sense. It had tremor sense. Our bad. And with that being said, you know, obviously I have to do the if I don't say it now, I'll forget to say it, you know, like and subscribe. And if you happen to be in the giving mood, if I can get Fabio to sit down and send me the PDF or send me the Microsoft Word on our Patreon, I will put up the big book Aratar survival guide on our Patreon. So you could download all the lore that we came up with and you could see what happened every time you did a recall knowledge check. So let us know in the comments down below if you guys use recall knowledge or knowledge check in your campaigns. Have it been useful? Do you find that maybe it's really not all that great? Do you disagree completely? Do you agree wholeheartedly? Let us know. So from here, over in my GM Danger Dome, we are Nothing Ventured, Nothing Game. Have a wonderful day, evening, or good afternoon, depending on like your time of day. Because usually I watch these things. Anyway, you know what it is. Have a good one, everyone.